event Jacob read about is known as the Transfiguration of Jesus. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark also include this event. And unlike Luke, they both use the word transfigured. Jesus was transfigured, they say. According to dictionary.com, the word transfigure means to change in outward form or appearance. So Luke writes that the appearance of Jesus' face was altered. It was changed, transformed, transfigured. Now you might wonder, what was the point of the transfiguration? Why did this need to happen? I've wondered this at times. The point of the transfiguration. Well, verse 28 begins with the words, "Now about eight days after these sayings." You might ask, well, what sayings? We need to go back to verse 20 of chapter 9, same chapter. Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" We saw this in Matthew chapter 16 last week. So this is Luke's version of this conversation. Peter answers, "The Christ of God." And then Jesus tells them, verse 22, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." So Peter says, "You're the Christ," but then Jesus says, "Well, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to be killed in Jerusalem." Not what they expected to hear. So after this, 8 days later, the transfiguration of Jesus happens. So what's the significance? Well, I think of the transfiguration as sort of like a teaser trailer. Teaser trailer is like a 30-second video, a clip, often shown to give you a preview of an upcoming, maybe highly anticipated movie. And so the Transfiguration acts sort of like a teaser trailer. The Transfiguration gave Peter, James, and John, and us, the readers, a sneak peek of what would happen beyond the suffering and death of Jesus. A sneak peek of his glory. So 8 days after this conversation, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain. We don't know what the mountain was, but they go up a mountain. The purpose of going up this mountain, we're told, is so that Jesus can pray. And as he's praying, as I already mentioned, the appearance of his face is altered, transfigured. And even his clothing becomes dazzling white. The New International Version says that his clothing becomes as bright as a flash of lightning. And we're also told that two men are talking with Jesus. Who are these two men? Verse 30, Moses and Elijah. And what are they talking to Jesus about? Verse 31, his departure, literally his exodus, which is a connection with Moses, who led the people out of Egypt toward the promised land. They're talking about his departure, Jesus' departure. And that is to be accomplished where? At Jerusalem. So, in this sermon series, we're skipping a lot of the teaching, the events of Jesus. We're only getting to a few, but what I hope you're seeing is all of this is leading toward Jerusalem. And eventually, we'll get to Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Easter. All of this is leading to Jerusalem. So remember in Matthew 16:21, we saw this last week, that Jesus said that he must go to Jerusalem. This is God's plan, that he go to Jerusalem. This is something that must happen. And this is where his departure will take place. Now, the departure of Jesus refers to, I believe, more than just his death. I believe it also includes his resurrection and ascension, which will also take place at Jerusalem. So they're talking about this. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, they're talking about the departure of Jesus, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, which will take place, again, at Jerusalem. Now, as all of this is happening, Peter, James, and John, they're sleeping. I like to imagine that this is happening at night, which would make this more spectacular. The glory of Jesus, his face being transfigured, his clothing dazzling white. We're told that they are sleepy, so maybe it does happen at night, but we can't be sure. But either way, they've been sleeping, and imagine their surprise when they wake up. They see the glory of Jesus. They see him transfigured, and they also see the two men, Moses and Elijah, who are there with him. So they're catching this near the end as Moses and Elijah are leaving. And as they're leaving, Peter says to Jesus, he's the one who normally speaks up. We saw this in Matthew 16, the one who often speaks for the others, the leader in a sense. He speaks up, and in verse 33, he says, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents or 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." And Luke adds that Peter doesn't really know what he's saying, which is kind of comical. Sometimes that's true of Peter. It's true of people who often are the first to speak. A lot of times they say something really good, but the more you talk, the more you say things that are not so good. So this was a case when Peter said something that wasn't really a good thing. It wasn't a good suggestion, and we're not told really why that was so. It could be perhaps that Peter wants to prolong their stay. That seems to be a motive in this. He wants Moses and Elijah not to leave, but to stay. And perhaps that could be seen as delaying the departure of Jesus, delaying the plan of God. It also could be that this is a bad idea because Peter is giving equal status to Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. A shelter, a tent for each, 3 equals. But one of the points of this story is that Moses and Elijah are not equal with Jesus. And so maybe for one or both or other reasons as well, this was not a good idea that Peter suggests. And as Peter is speaking, a cloud, picturing God's presence, it comes and it overshadows them. And as you can expect, the disciples are afraid. These were men who knew the Old Testament scriptures. They knew what the Old Testament said about being in the presence of a holy God. And so they're terrified as this cloud overshadows them, the presence of God. And a voice comes from the cloud, the voice of God the Father, and he announces, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." We could think for a moment, what's the significance of Moses and Elijah? Are they just 2 random guys from the Old Testament? Well, one popular view is that they represent the law and the prophets. Moses represents the law, Elijah, the prophets. And in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, the law and the prophets was a way of referring to the Old Testament scriptures. I believe also this is telling us that Jesus is greater than Moses and Elijah. There are many parallels, especially with Moses, Jesus going up to the mountain. He's transfigured as Moses, in a sense, was, as he caught a glimpse of the glory of God. His face shone when he came down the mountain. God said to Moses, "I am Yahweh, I am the Lord," and he gave to him the 10 Commandments. Here, God says, the Father says, "This is my Son, listen to him." And so in a sense, the Father is saying that the words of Jesus have equal status to the words of the law and the prophets, the Old Testament scriptures. So listen to him. So again, proclaiming really the real identity of Jesus. His glory has been veiled in his incarnation when he became human like us. People didn't see his glory. He just looked like anyone else. But here on this mountain, as he's transfigured, they get a glimpse. Peter, James, and John get a glimpse of the glory of Jesus. And so, "This is my Son, my chosen one." And that connects Jesus with the suffering servant of Isaiah, who would come to suffer for the sins of others. The chosen one, my chosen one, listen to him. And after they hear the voice, everything goes back to normal. The cloud is gone. Moses and Elijah are nowhere to be seen. And Jesus' appearance is no longer transfigured. And Luke writes that Peter, James, and John kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. Well, I said before that we could think of the transfiguration as sort of like a sneak peek, teaser trailer. The transfiguration was a sneak peek of Jesus' future glory. And in that sense, the transfiguration gives us a message of hope. Remember that the transfiguration took place 8 days after Jesus had spoken about suffering and dying in Jerusalem. Going to that city would result in suffering and death, but it would also lead to his resurrection and ascension. And so the message, one of the messages of the transfiguration, is that the journey through suffering and death leads to glory. And we can even apply that to our own lives, not just to what happened with Jesus, but to our own lives. We can look beyond the present troubles to our future glory. Lately, if I've been struggling to come up with a story or an illustration for one of my sermons, I've asked, some of you are aware of this program, ChatGPT. It's an AI thing, sort of like Google, but a little more high-powered. I don't get it to write my sermons, but sometimes I'm stuck for an idea, and I'll ask it a question. And I asked it to give me some examples of times when people got a sneak peek of something highly anticipated. And it gave me a few examples. Most of them I was aware of. But what I noticed was that a lot of the examples were of movies that people had been very excited about, but really didn't live up to expectations. One of the examples was the rise of Skywalker, the final Star Wars movie in the Skywalker saga. I don't know, some people enjoyed the movie, but I thought it was quite disappointing. I had been excited about it, excited to see those teaser trailers, the full trailer, all of that, but the sneak peek didn't really live up to, or the final movie didn't really live up to the sneak peek, the trailers. And so a lot of times we anticipate these things, but they end up disappointing. They don't live up to the expectations. Now, Jesus, on the Mount of Transfiguration, he gave us, the readers of this, he gave Peter, James, and John sort of a sneak peek, as I said, of the future glory of Jesus beyond the suffering and death to the glory that would be his when he rose from the dead, when he ascended into heaven. And I thought about, and we'll end with this, Hebrews chapter 12. I thought of Hebrews chapter 12 as I was thinking about how Jesus would have to go through suffering and death before he would reach the goal of glory. And we saw this in Luke 24 as well, with those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, how they had been very discouraged after the crucifixion of Jesus and really didn't even believe the stories about the empty tomb and its significance. And Jesus opened, he didn't have the Bible there, but in his teaching, he opened up to them the Old Testament scriptures, the law and the prophets, as it's called, and showed them how the Christ must suffer. It was necessary for him to suffer before he would enter into his glory. And Hebrews chapter 12 speaks of this, and there's also an encouragement for us as well. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. This follows chapter 11, of course, chapter about faith, the faith of many people in the Old Testament. There's a long list of people given. And then verse 1 of chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, people who remain faithful to God, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance. Notice the word endurance. The race that is set before us. Likening our life to a race that requires endurance, a difficult race. Hills and valleys, requiring endurance. Verse 2, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So, why was Jesus willing to endure the cross? It says, for the joy that was set before him. That was the reason. That joy included the glory of being seated at the right hand of the throne of God. But I also think the joy he was looking forward to included sharing that glory with us. That through his death and resurrection, our sins would be paid for. Putting our trust in him would bring to us forgiveness and eternal life, and one day we will share that glory with him. We will be with him. And all of the troubles, all of the suffering will be behind us. For the joy that was set before him. Do you think today that Jesus is disappointed that he had to go through all of that suffering and death? No. The outcome was worth it. The glory that awaits us won't disappoint. You know, we look forward to a lot of things, and some of those things, even many of those things, they might disappoint. But the glory that awaits us won't disappoint. So look at verse 3. There's an application here to us. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself. Speaking of all of the suffering he endured at Jerusalem, the beating, the flogging, the crucifixion. Think about that. Consider that. The one who was willing to do that for the joy that was set before him, enduring all of that, consider that so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Jesus endured that, all of that, and so he says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. He had a journey set before him to go to Jerusalem, where he knew he would suffer and be killed. But he also knew, as he said, that he would be raised. He would ascend into heaven. He would be seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And so he looked beyond the suffering to the glory, which included our own glory. And so the message here in Hebrews 12, as we think about this foretaste, this sneak peek of the glory of Jesus, beyond the suffering. The message here is don't grow weary or faint-hearted. Don't give up. Keep on going. Don't abandon Jesus. We said earlier in Luke chapter 9 that, it's often difficult to follow me. But it will be worth it. Don't stop following him. So the sneak peek of the Transfiguration was meant to encourage us. Yes, on this journey that we're on, this race, whatever the metaphor you want to use, there might be disappointment. There probably will be. Many times of struggle and trouble and disappointments. There might be danger. But the message of the Transfiguration is that the end is glorious. So keep on going. Don't give up. For Peter, James, and John, and Jesus, there was lots of trouble ahead, especially in Jerusalem. But that would not be the end. The end would be glory. So endure that. Because beyond the suffering, beyond death, leads to glory.